classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both behavioral forms of learning. But there are three theories of cognitive learning that you'll want to know as well. You'll want to be familiar with the primary researchers for these three theories. You'll want to be familiar with what they did to research these theories. And you'll also want to know what each theory says about the world. Could you identify an example of this theory in use, in other words? So let's start with latent learning. Now, latent learning refers to learning that doesn't immediately show itself because it hasn't been immediately reinforced, but it still occurs. Now, Tolman used rats and mazes to research latent learning. He used different groups of rats. Some of the rats were placed in a maze, and when they got to the end of the maze, they were given rewards right off the bat, reinforced from the very first time they got to the end of the maze. So operant conditioning would tell us that they'll make fewer and fewer mistakes the more they do that, because they're learning the layout of the maze because they're getting reinforcement for that. Well, Tolman used another group of rats, and they were allowed to explore the maze, but when they got to the end, they weren't given any reinforcement. So we might think that they weren't really learning the layout of the maze. But what happened is, after several days of never receiving reinforcement, the very first time these new rats got reinforced when they got to the end, they almost immediately caught up to the learning of the rats that had been reinforced every time, which strongly suggests that they were learning the layout of the maze. They just weren't showing us because there was no reason to. Think about a mall or a place that you've been to. There may be a store in that mall that you never go to, and if I asked you to think about it, you would have a really tough time finding it. But if I told you that $1 million is hidden in that store, we might suspect that by walking around that store for some time in the past, you've got that information somewhere up here, and now that there's a chance to use it, you can find it, and you can get there probably pretty quickly. So that's latent learning, when you learn something even though it's not showing because you haven't been reinforced for that learning just yet. The second theory of cognitive learning is learned helplessness. Now, this one has a lot of real-world application, but it's from the research of Martin Seligman, and Seligman used dogs and electrical shocks to demonstrate this phenomenon. Now, if you understand classical conditioning, you know that if you put a dog in a cage and you ring a bell and shock them, well, eventually they'll be conditioned to fear not just the shock, which is natural, but also that sound, because the sound has been paired with the shock. But what Seligman did is he put these dogs in the cage, and he had to harness them in so they would feel the shock on the floor when they heard the sound. So make the sound, shock the floor, dogs try to escape, they can't, so they learn the association between the sound and the shock. You do this enough, clearly you would expect classical conditioning to occur. In other words, once those dogs hear the sound, you expect them to freak out because they expect the shock now, whether or not they actually get it. What Seligman found is, after conditioning had occurred, he took the harnesses off the dog and just played the sound. He expected that even though they weren't being shocked, just because they heard that sound, the dogs would jump away. But they didn't. They would hear the sound and they would get distressed. They would whimper, they would cry, it sounds very sad, but they wouldn't try to move, even though this time they could. They could get away. They were not harnessed. But Seligman created this concept of learned helplessness, and it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the dogs were conditioned to be afraid of that noise, but they'd also learned that it didn't matter what they did, they couldn't get away. They'd always been harnessed in the past. So even though now they could get away if they wanted to, they just sat there. It was very sad. Well, this has a lot of real-world application when we look at people who have tried to break addictions or people who've tried to get out of abusive relationships. Even though today they might be successful if they tried to make a change or escape a bad situation, if they've tried in the past and they've never succeeded, some people just have this learned helplessness. It doesn't matter what I do, I'm not going to succeed. I see this a lot in my students sometimes. Maybe you've had a rough life that kept you from doing the things you want to do, and now you're in a situation where you could, but now you just feel like it doesn't matter, it's not worth it, you won't succeed. So learned helplessness is a cognitive theory that has a lot of real-world application. The final one is insight. This is one you're probably more familiar with, and Kohler used chimpanzees to demonstrate that sometimes animals and human beings will have what we call aha moments. So you don't have to have watched someone do something, you don't have to be rewarded for a behavior, for you to be able to cognitively combine different things to see if these new behaviors will lead to reinforcement. So no prior learning really has to occur, it's just this magical aha moment that comes to you. So latent learning, learned helplessness, and insight. Make sure you know the researchers involved, the studies involved, and what those theories have to say about the world.